Welcome back to the Female Dating Strategy, the meanest female-only podcast on the internet. I'm your host, Diana.
And I'm Rose. And today I could not be more delighted, Diana. Who is our illustrious guest of the hour?
We have the, drumroll, Lundy Bancroft.
Oh, Lundy Bancroft, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for all the fuss.
Are you unaccustomed to all the fuss when you're on a show?
I can't really claim to be unaccustomed to all the fuss, no.
Well, you are not only the one-time male exception we make to this podcast, you are now the two-time male exception, because this is the second time we're having you on and we're so excited. We wanted to make sure that today we have something new for all of you, because we've been seeing a lot of really disturbing things happening in the press, in the media, and in the world in general. And it seems like it's a sad, scary place out there. And so we thought, now is the time to hear from Lundy and for him to give us some solid advice, as he usually does. And so, let's just jump right into it.
One thing I wanted to ask Lundy, do you remember the last time you were on the show with Savannah and Ro?
I do, but I have to admit it's a fairly dim memory at this many years out.
True. This is why we wanted to host you again, because I don't know if our current listeners have even know that you once recorded an episode with the prior host. And so we wanted to make sure that, another generation of women are being introduced to the really important work that you do. One way that I found you before, I think even FDS, was I love to go coast along on the world of Reddit and see what's happening, especially in the subreddits of women dating. And your name appears again and again and again. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a few things that I think are the outstanding points. One is that the whole world tends to assume that an abuser's got something psychologically wrong with him, a man that abuses women. And so the assumption is that the problem is somewhere in his heart, and we have to figure out what's bothering him and help him work out his issues and figure out what happened in the family he grew up in and try to fix him psychologically. And it's very misleading, because that turns out to have almost nothing to do with why a man who abuses women is doing what he does. And the problem turns out to be almost entirely in his mentality and very little in his psychology. By the way, I'm not saying that this is true of all destructive behaviors. I think there are some destructive behaviors in the world that are very much driven by psychological problems. This just turns out not to be one of them. And I was reluctant myself when I first came into the field to accept the extent to which this is a problem of learned values and attitudes. It's a belief system problem that's rooted in a whole set of entitlements that this man started learning, usually quite early in life, that say that he has the right to simply require certain things of his female partners, and he has a right to punish, to enforce those demands when he feels she's not meeting them adequately. So I talk a lot about how much abuse is really about enforcement of his will. Like, his feelings don't have much to do with it. He's got the same feelings almost everybody has. Almost everybody has insecurities. Almost everybody has times of feeling bad about themselves. Almost everybody actually does get angry. So it has very little to do with that. It has to do with his sense that he gets to enforce what he wants and require things to happen in his way. So that's unusual enough that I think that's part of why there's quite a bit of attention to my work. There's the fact that I'm a man, which gives me a certain kind of credibility when I'm speaking very critically about the behavior of some men, because women tend to get silenced a lot and shut down and ridiculed when they talk frankly about male behavior.
I agree. I just have to say, I really want to thank you for the book to begin with, because not that I've personally been a victim of any sort of abuse, but I've had a lot of friends who've been in really abusive dynamics with their boyfriends or their husbands. And sometimes, no matter how much advice I gave them that I thought was sound, I felt like they wouldn't listen to me. I feel like many times you've been the neutral third party in my friend group, where I'm like, well, just listen to Lundy and just read his book. And it's just been like an easy way for me to give them the information without it coming from me, because I do agree that for some reason, for a lot of women, it carries a lot more weight when it comes from a man. I just wanted to ask you a question about, I have a lot of pushback from friends who think that abuse is something that can be therapized away. A lot of people will say, he just needs to go to therapy. Or a man will do anything but go to therapy. And they seem to think that, when they're in an emotionally abusive relationship with their partner, just going to therapy will be a Band-Aid solution to fix it. In your experience working with men like this, do you feel like that's effective or no?
It has zero effectiveness. And that's one of the ways that we started to catch on to the fact that this was not a psychological problem, was noticing that there was never any gains made from a guy going in therapy, and all different kinds of therapists using all different kinds of approaches, zip. So that was one of the things that tipped us off. There also started to be some research showing that this is not rooted in the man's psychology. And at the same time, I understand when you're living with someone that's being really mean to you, that you care about, and so you're starting to feel trapped there, you want to put your hopes on something. And so it's very tempting to think, well, if I could just get him to therapy so he'd work on his issues, that would help. An abuser program, what's typically called a batterer intervention program, is completely different from therapy. It's not actually trying to address his emotional world much at all. It's almost entirely working on changing his attitudes and getting him to develop some empathy for the harm that he's doing. So it's a completely different kind of program.
And Lundy, isn't this the program where in order to ensure success, you also would have check-ins with the spouse or the partner who was the battered victim?
Yes, and any program that's being properly run is either contacting the woman or making sure that an advocate that they're working with is contacting the woman. For one thing, abusers are completely unreliable in their own descriptions of what's happened. So working with him is meaningless if you're not finding out what's really going on. Not that you tell him, what she says. You shouldn't tell him what she says. That would blow up in her face. But it still keeps you awake and guides you in how you work with him and how you aim discussions with him, and gets you not to start buying in to his very twisted way of characterizing what's going on. So you can't do this work safely or productively if you're not hearing the woman's story of what's actually happened. The other thing is that he will lie to her about the program itself if the program's not in touch with her. He'll say things like, oh, I learned from the program that when you yell at me, that's what really sets me off, so you can't yell at me anymore, and things like that. He'll figure out ways to use the program against her, because that's part of what abusers do, is they figure out how to use everything against her.
Mm-hmm. We're also seeing really disturbing trends of younger boys exhibiting really abusive behavior. Do you feel like there's been a rise in that in the last 30 years or so?
I do, although I should say it has always been a problem, because the boys who grow up with being exposed in the home to a man who's abusing their mother, maybe their father, maybe their stepfather, maybe a mom's boyfriend, whoever it might be, they will start mimicking those behaviors from a really early age, especially if the abuser's of the style that kind of tries to draw the boys into it and tries to get them imitating his style. But even if he doesn't, kids will start to imitate it just because kids imitate adult behavior that they see around them. That's part of what they do. So it was already a problem, and it's already one of the huge warning signs that a woman is being abused when you're seeing, abusive or very anti-female behaviors or statements from her sons. But yes, I also do believe it's escalated. The internet, unfortunately, the level of discourse on the internet is rock bottom. This is like not humanity at its best. This is humanity at its worst in how comment threads go on the internet and how people post stuff, because they're not accountable. They don't even have to use their real names and faces. They're not going to be answerable for how they behave. So it brings out the worst in people. And kids at younger and younger ages have access to social media and the internet. And so we're getting such young access to pornography. We're getting such young access to young boys being able to listen to adult men talking trash about women. And so, yeah, the influence is getting more pervasive and getting down to younger and younger ages.
Lundy, just last week we had Dr. Gail Dines on the podcast. Are you familiar with her work?
Oh, yes, very much so.
We had a wonderful interview with her. And in that interview, we were discussing, there was a recent show that was popular on Netflix. In the pre-interview, you mentioned you hadn't seen it. To be honest, I hadn't either, because I knew what it was about. I know my limits when it comes to what I can actually watch on media. But the show is called Adolescence. It's about a young boy. I believe he's 12 years old. And it shows sort of the environment around him and what led him to murder a classmate of his for rejecting him. And this is something that I thought was so interesting, because it really showed the perspective of how the women in his life were, sort of negligible. His mother, his sister, the school teacher who noticed something was wrong, but nobody really wanted to listen to her. Even the female police officer who was doing a lot of the detecting work. It showed all the ways in which their perspectives were sort of slighted or pushed aside. And it showed how his own father had anger issues and the inability to sort of have an intimate, healthy relationship with his son, and ultimately how this fails our young boys in teaching them how to be, whole and healthy human beings first and foremost before it even delves into what it means to be a man. With this rise of sort of, media that shows more and more what's happening behind the scenes, like how would you talk to parents about what they need to do in order to help their children confront this really crazy Wild West world of social media that we live in today?
Well, and before I answer that question, I want to say that I've been very, very heavily influenced by Gail Dine's work and by Jackson Katz's work. And I think they both really help us understand that young boys are not just learning a kind of toxic masculinity of being sort of unemotional and overly violent and overly focused on courage and, and having to be never afraid and that kind of stuff, but that they're also being specifically socialized from a very young age to feel superior to females, to feel superior to girls and women and to look down on them from a very young age, and it's shaping what happens. Parents can't magically fix these huge influences coming from so many different places, but there are a few things that they can do. And one thing they can do is, first of all, make sure that their boys are growing up being encouraged to feel feelings and not to be unfeeling, not to be brave all the time. You've got to let your boys cry. Stop telling your boys not to cry so that they have room from the beginning to have a normal range of feelings and to not be shut down. And at the same time, they have to be taught from very young ages, starting as young as age 3, about respect for females. Honestly, 3 years old is not too young to start talking to, girls are like equal to you, and you're going to treat them with respect, and you're going to treat women with respect. And boys have to be kept on a very tight leash about how they talk to their mothers. Not that they can't be angry or complain or have grievances. They should be allowed to do that. But that they can't be insulting, that they can't be demeaning, that they can't give orders to their moms. And mothers are very heavily socialized to believe that they need to put up with this stuff from boys and that boys will be boys. And that's not true. If she doesn't like how she's being spoken to, she needs to listen to that gut reaction. And, I watch these interactions a lot, for example, where a mom is telling a boy, well, you have to say you're sorry. And finally, he'll say he's sorry, except he'll say it in a way where he still obviously didn't mean it. He'll just go, okay, I'm sorry. And that has to not fly. It has to be like, no, we're not moving forward from here until there's actually a change in how you're being towards me. And if he says, where's my orange juice? Rather than saying, oh, sorry, honey, I'm really busy, she needs to say, there's not going to be any orange juice this morning after you talk to me like that. No, orange juice is waiting until tomorrow morning. Now, you can't talk to me like that. But the thing is, if she has a male partner, her partner's got to back her up on that, dad or stepdad or whatever, because it doesn't work if she is the one setting limits on the boy and he's not supporting that and he's not doing it himself, or he's actively undermining her. There's going to be great limitations to what she can do. So those two things have to happen at the same time: the overall raising sensitive boys and the messages like we treat everybody equally, which means it's best to pair that with teaching boys from 3 years old about not being racist, about not being homophobic. In other words, they've got to have just a general sense from very early in life that mistreating or looking down on females is part of prejudice in general. And we all agree that prejudice is bad. And the reason I'm underlining that point is because there are a lot of families where prejudice is not okay, except if you're talking about females, then it is okay. And that's got to stop.
Well, I have two questions here. One is, how would you advise single mothers to handle this if they didn't have a male figure to back them up? And the second is, you mentioned that a lot of the boys learn this from the male figures in their household. But I feel like what I'm noticing is that we live in this culture of hostility now where a lot of the prominent men in the world are, for lack of a better word, assholes. And so they have a cultural environment that is reinforcing them to be terrible people. And so, how would you advise both single mothers, but also just people who might have a great family setup, but then the boy is still getting corrupted by other forces? Like, how would you advise them?
Well, first of all, I don't think she needs a male partner. I really just think that if she does have a female partner, he needs to be on board or there's going to be a real problem.
Right.
A single mother can raise boys in ways that really respect females if she's not being undermined by the rest of the world. But as you're pointing out, the rest of the world is also working against her. And nowadays, when you try to restrict your kids' access to social media, they're really upset with you about it. And you have to deal with a lot of anger and resentment from kids because they start to feel cut off from their friends. And that's something parents to some extent just have to sweat out, in my opinion. Like, your kids are going to be angry at you, and we're still going to say, sorry, you can't be on your phone. Sorry, you can't be on social media until you're quite a bit older. We're just not doing that. Or if you can talk to your friends on the phone, but let's focus on getting you and your friends together in person. Because also the social trend of kids simply getting together a lot less than they used to and hanging around on social media instead of physically getting together. But then we really need to look for ways to connect boys to good men. And there are good men out there. And I actually think there are just as many good men out there as there've ever been. I just think that the bad men are getting worse. But
Yeah, fair.
including, there's a lot of great young guys. I mean, I see so many like high school and college age boys now who are so cool. Like, they're hyped up on women's rights and stuff. And they're pushing gender stereotypes. So yeah, there's a lot of things to be really disturbed by. There's also a lot of things to be really encouraged about. But we have to figure out, well, how do we connect to those things? Like, how do we get our boys connected to these other kids, and how do we get boys connected to different kind of men in their adult contacts? It can be hard to find these people. And you can sometimes find them through a faith community, and sometimes other faith communities are just riddled with these real patriarchal attitudes. Sometimes you can find them through a boys and girls club. Sometimes there's big problems at the boys and girls club. It really takes a lot of digging around. And a single mom has only got so much time. Like, she can't be an endless researcher. It's very, very challenging.
Right. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask about as well is that, is there anything new that you've been observing? Just because I think these days, almost everything is online. And I think that the usual tools that women had, where they met a guy at a bar or an event or a hobby, has kind of been like, it used to be the norm, but now it's really not. And I feel like almost everyone I speak to is dating someone off an app. And I mean, in general, we feel like that doesn't really promote safety for women because there isn't really an element of any kind of vetting. A lot of these apps are essentially selling your data, and so they don't really care about the kinds of people you're meeting. So is there anything that you would advise to women who are, using apps or who are meeting men that they don't know to watch out for that could be a potential sign of abuse?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is meet several times in very public settings before spending any time alone together. And as you're saying now, the dating app is all about presentation, right? It's all you're putting forward an image of what you wish you were, or not even that, of just how you want other people to think you are. And so it's tremendous artifice, and that's a huge, huge problem. But there are a couple of other things. Because you don't tend to find tons of people, even on a dating app, that you want to meet, it's very tempting to just start saying, well, this guy's wrong in 3 different ways, but there's a couple ways that he's right. And he's kind of seems like a nice guy. So let's go forward. And you've got to keep a much shorter list. You got to just routinely say, nope, 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 nope. And it's discouraging, but you really need to do it. Otherwise, you spend so much time on people who end up really not being ready to give anything significant to a woman in a relationship. But then the last thing I would say is the trickiest, which is, women are up against the fact that you've been socialized from the youngest of ages by heavy social pressure to be attracted to exactly qualities that you should be running 100 miles an hour away from.
Right.
By movies.
I'm thinking of Twilight. I'm thinking of 50 Shades of Grey. And that was just, in the last decade or two. But obviously, it far predates that.
In the first 20 pages of 50 Shades of Grey, which is as far as I got, I couldn't stomach any more than that. But he has covered every warning sign in my list of warning signs that I share with women about early dating.
Wow.
About things you want to watch for from the beginning of a relationship. He covered them all. Like, that guy is batterer extraordinaire, rapist, such, horrible, horrible, horrible guy. And you're being taught that this is sexy, right? And the thing is that kind of early conditioning is hard to break. Like, you can't just wake up in the morning and think, oh, I need to change what I'm attracted to because I'm being attracted to things that aren't good for me. Like, attraction runs deep enough that we can't just totally control what we're attracted to. Although over periods of years, you can actually, if you really work at it, you can reorient what you're attracted to. You can't do it overnight. But there's a side issue here about 50 Shades of Grey, which is that because of the whole world of pornography and how awful it is, there's really almost no kind of healthy erotica, like non-pornographic sexual materials out there for women and men. And so something that is presented as being for women is like, oh my God, erotica for women. That's great. And 50 Shades of Grey, I would not call erotica. That's pornography. And if you want me to explain what the distinction I'm making, I'm happy to do that. But it's totally pornographic. But that's a lot of why it gets away with doing that, is because there's not a lot out there that's for women, so that you can get sucked into that kind of thing. But yes, that's just warning signs, tick, 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 all the boxes. It's so destructive. And yet you're being conditioned that that's what's really sexy.
And I think that there's like a larger cultural narrative at play to kind of convince women that these kinds of disturbing portrayals of men are romantic. I mean, sexy is one thing, but it's also like this is desirable in a partner, which I think is scarier. Because I feel like we're just having this romanticized at a large scale where a lot of women are finally checking out of relationships altogether. And they're like, this is a very scary ecosystem for me in which to date, with all my human rights being stripped away and with men just being a lot angrier than they used to be. And now it's like, you hear all of these things about like the male loneliness crisis. And like the solution seems to be that women are the ones who have to solve this for men somehow. I don't know if there's any merit specifically for women to socialize men who are antisocial, because from what I understand of, even from remembering what I read of your book, it seems like women trying to do that and fixing men, it doesn't go anywhere.
It's a disaster. I completely agree with you. Fix the guy. A guy who's really kind, thoughtful man, who's a little bit shut down emotionally, you may be able to bring along. But a guy who's like doesn't treat women well or has negative attitudes or doesn't respect your opinions, forget it. You're not going to bring him along. And I forget if I explained this in Why Does He Do That, but I've explained it in blog posts that I've written, is that men's attitudes towards women don't come from their experience with women. Men's attitudes towards women come from their experience with men. And so there's very little a woman can do to change a man's attitude towards women. He has to start hanging around with different kinds of guys. And the parallel that I use with people is when you meet a white person who's really racist, you don't think, oh, this person must have had bad experiences with people of color. You think, oh, this person must have grown up and be hanging around the wrong white people.
Right.
And yet, when we see a guy who's really hostile towards females, we think, oh, he must have had bad experience with females. No, it's going to fit the same pattern as a white person who's got bad attitudes towards people of color. It's about the same way that's about the white people that raised him and that he's been hanging around all his life. With a man, it's like about the men who influenced him growing up and the men he's been around in his adult life. I talk about the temptation that a woman has to be like the ambassador for women. I say, you're going to want to be the ambassador for women and prove to him that women aren't so bad. And unfortunately, I understand it's all the best intentions, but it's not going to work, because for now you'll be like, he'll say, oh, you're different from other women. And then a year from now, he'll be saying you're just like other women.
Right. Because the underlying hostility isn't really going anywhere. But that metric, would it be a good suggestion to women to observe his friend group when you're dating him? Because that says a lot about who he is as a person. Because early on in this podcast, I remember telling Rose, I was like, you're the sum total of your 5 closest friends. And I think this is really true for men as well.
I think it says a lot. And unfortunately, a lot of guys are kind of isolated, but the women are not responsible for that. However, and they can't fix that either. But yes, I think I want to know, for example, does he talk with friends about real stuff, or is it always just 100% superficial? But I also want to know one thing that's kind of hard to find out, which is, are his interactions with males largely about bonding against females? Because that's how a lot of guys operate, is when they're hanging out with the other guys, they're talking bad about women, or they're talking in very objectifying, sexual, dehumanizing ways about women, and get a glimpse into that. Well, eventually you tend to. I think if you're going out with a guy, but you might have to be going out with him for a little while, you start to see. And I always tell people, be very, very careful about anything that he says, like, I'm just joking, or my friend was just joking, or we're just joking. Watch out, because that stuff tends to be not just joking. I mean, it may have been in the form of a joke, but it tends to be very revealing of really real issues. So don't buy it when he says, oh, we were just kidding around. You got to have a sense of humor. Ugh. Watch out.
This reminds me of how, they say in vino veritas, like when one is in their cups of alcohol, that's when the truth comes out. I always feel like the equivalent of that with men is I'm just joking. If you hear it, I'm just joking, know that they're not joking whatsoever. Like that's actually typically what they believe. And they're sort of testing the waters to see what they can get away with. Because it's a gradual erosion and broaching of boundaries and respect. Would you not agree? It's not like it comes overnight. but it's something that happens, I think, gradually over time. And so this is another way in which women tend to be bamboozled because they think, well, it was so good in the beginning and he was so respectful and I must not be communicating properly. To those women who are just so unsure about how it could have gotten to how bad it is, like, what would you say to them?
And you just described perfectly, by the way, exactly the kinds of things that go on where he's on much better behavior in the early stages because on some level, consciously or subconsciously, he knows that he's not going to have a relationship unless for at least a while at the beginning, he makes things look better than that. Then the slide begins into starting to more and more feel comfortable enough to show his true self. And we don't want to see his true self. And by that time you're dating him, you have investment. Your emotions are starting to be involved in it. You're starting to have hope. And some things that you're really craving and longing for, you start to think maybe are going to get met. So it's very tempting then to start to make excuses or let things go by. Then combined with all those messages, which you also just pointed to, that women get that say you're overreacting, you got to just stick with him, love heals all, and all this. I'm sorry to say it, but it's crap.
It's crap.
It is crap.
So then you hit up against this stuff. And I think the way you just articulated it is perfect, that you have to go on the assumption that actually this is when you're seeing the real stuff. It's not the early stuff that was the real stuff. And don't discount anything. And with respect to your Latin phrase there, take it seriously what he does when he's drinking too. And I know you meant it more analogous to other situations, but it is also true literally of when he's drinking. Because it's, oh, I was drinking. It's like, oh God, what people do when they're drunk reveals so much of what's really true about.
Mm-hmm. I always assume I'm meeting the representative the first few months. I'm like, this is his representative. This isn't him just yet,
That's right. His agent. That's great. That's good. I like that a lot.
Right. I think that that's the best way to see it because I think this was your book. I don't remember, but I remember somewhere reading that, when someone is trying to charm you, instead of saying, oh, this person is charming, ask yourself, why are they charming me specifically? Because I think a lot of women aren't able to discern between a man being emotionally vulnerable versus weaponizing that emotion. Because a lot of women think that, oh, he opened up to me so fast and like I could have a heart to heart with him like right away. And they see this as like a green flag. And I have to let them know that actually it's not really a good thing that he's opening up to you quite this quickly because you've just known him like 20 days, less than that. And in most cases, he's just a stranger to you. And it's really hard to like impress upon them because they really want to believe in like this goodness of men narrative that he's just trying to be honest with them. And it's not like a ploy or a game or like love bombing or something. And that's the thing. Like, how do you differentiate between what is vulnerability and what is him just putting on a mask or a role to try to convince you to, give him material to use?
Well, the first thing I guess I would say is keep watching what his orientation is towards you, because so far this is just about what his orientation is towards himself, what his relationship is to his own feelings. But is he interested in your feelings? Is he actually thoughtful? Is he actually show signs of he's thinking about you? And like, is there any sense of balance there? So that's one issue. Another issue is, which you already pointed to, is the things just feel like they're happening too fast, and you have to trust your gut about that. Like, yeah, it's great that he's opening up, but if he's opening up at this really odd rate, to be on guard about that. But a lot of what I end up saying about a number of things that are kind of in the gray area, because as you're saying, it's kind of a gray area. It could be that he's actually a feeling guy, which would be a lovely thing, is just don't decide yet. Keep your eyes open. And I have a similar thing that I say about charm in a different sense, about charm in the sense of the guy who's very smooth and knows what he wants to do that evening and has a plan for you and says, oh, let's go do this. And then let's go do this. And he's poised and self-confident. And we tend to take the attitude, if somebody's very charming, of, oh, that's like 2 points in his favor, and it's going to take me extra bad stuff to convince me that he's bad. And I encourage people to put charm in the opposite category. Say, no, that's 2 points against him. It's going to take extra good things to convince me that he's bad. And there are some charming people that are good people, but charming people generally are bad. More than half the time, in my experience, charming people are bad news. Actually, well, more than half the time, charming people are bad news. Why? Because developing charm is a lot of work. That doesn't come naturally to someone. They did that over a period of years by working hard to develop it. And so then you have to say, well, why? Why did they want to put so much energy into developing charm? Well, when a man is putting that much energy into developing charm, it's usually because he's into power over women. And he's figured out that that's how you get power over women. This is one of the things that I most say is that the abusive man's problem is that his attitude about an intimate relationship is not really about intimacy and connection. It's about power. It's about what can put him in a more powerful position. And so you want to have big radar out well, is this starting to look like a power maneuver? And that reminds me of another point that I think is important with all these different styles, the charmer, the rapidly emotional guy, the guy who, you're a little concerned about how he is with his friends, or you're concerned about his lack of friends, because either of those can be a concern, is you have to be challenging early in a relationship. And I don't mean be deliberately a jerk, but I mean you have to be challenging. You have to be deliberately uncooperative at times. Because early in a relationship, when things are easy, it's very tempting to think that everything is great because it's so easy. But the thing is, you can't see what a guy is like until things are not easy. So you have to deliberately do things like when he has a plan, say, actually, that's not what I feel like doing tonight, and see how he reacts to that. You have to deliberately say oh, thanks for taking me somewhere, but I actually didn't like the food that much. You've got to deliberately be difficult. That's not being a jerk. Those are things that someone has every right to say, no, that's not what I feel like doing tonight, or I didn't really like that food, or no, I need a night off tonight to hang with my women friends. Do this stuff not just in a natural way, but actually do it in an extra way. Do it on purpose.
We call it aim to be a problem once a month.
Good. That's great. I like that, because that's one of the only times you're going to find out what's really going on is his reactions to being thwarted. That's what tends to most reveal where his issues are.
Lundy, this makes me think about I don't know if it was Gloria Steinem, but somebody had the expression where they said, everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power, right? Have you heard this before?
I hadn't heard that saying, no.
Yeah, everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And so I think I like when you were talking about how charm is often cultivated in order for a certain power to be held, a power differential to be implemented, right? And I think that's what I think our listeners and myself as well really need to understand, is that for a lot of men, it's not about the possibility of a fulfilling relationship and a partnership, and a lifetime of intimacy with someone. It's about the chance to hold power over another person.
So what if instead of looking for charm, you were looking for things like, is he fun? Does he seem free of ego, not big ego? Does he have people in his life that he cares about and where you like how he talks about them? Like you like what he has to say about his brothers and sisters, or you like what he has to say about his friends. Does he talk respectfully about his exes? And I don't mean he has to have great feelings towards them. We often don't have the best feelings towards our exes. But talk about them in a way that sounds like he's talking about a human being that he had some difficulties with or couldn't get along with, rather than talking about exes like they were pieces of dirt. I think you can tell a lot how a guy talks about his exes. And to really listen for what is his orientation towards people, and particularly towards women. And I'm not talking about that he idealizes them, because some abusers do, will talk about their mother like she's the greatest thing ever. But I'm not talking about idealizing. I'm talking about really talking about people so that it sounds like he's talking about people, human beings.
This is something you actually mentioned in one of your quotes, where you talk about how the idealization, sort of the pedestalization of women, is also another warning sign.
Yeah, because he's still not seeing her.
Yeah.
When he's telling you you're perfect and when he's telling you you're awful, either way, it shows he's not seeing you, because you're not perfect and you're not awful. So that's one of the things you can just keep asking yourself is, do I feel like he sees me?
The crazy thing is I've seen this dichotomy play out in real life, like in South Asia, where there's this massive goddess culture. So people think that they're in the clear because they're like, well, we worship goddesses. But at the same time, their intimate relationships with the women in their lives is terrible. But somehow it doesn't occur to them. They have this compartmentalizing way of looking at life where they're like, well, okay, fine. These women are different, but we worship goddesses. So somehow that's better. That means we respect women in general. And I think in a lot of these cultures, women are socialized, even in the US, I think women are socialized to be really agreeable and just downright people pleasers. So I think for a lot of them, it's really hard to admit that they're being emotionally manipulated because they want to believe that the men in their lives aren't trying to intentionally do something to them, especially when it comes to sex, right? Like, it's like a lot of men will say whatever they need to if they're not that serious about you in order to get you into bed. And I think a lot of women want to feel like they're the exception and not the rule. So, I mean, one of the things I'm curious to know about is what is your advice to women who have a hard time having boundaries with men? Because I think in general, we always advocate that like prevention is better than cure. It's better to just veto the kinds of men who are not good. But then obviously there are some that are go through and that you date for a few days, a few months, etc. And it's much harder to say no to people once you actually have a bond or relationship with them. So how do you like cultivate this mentality of being able to push back and say no?
Well, let me say first that that was really interesting what you said about goddess worship and how it doesn't necessarily translate into treating women any differently. That was really interesting. And it clicks for me because it's saying, well, I'll respect a woman as long as she's a goddess.
Hmm.
And but as soon as she's like a person, then she's not worthy of my respect anymore.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
What I would say about boundaries, which is something I think about a lot, but I'm far from incredibly knowledgeable about, is that the developing of strong boundaries, if you really haven't had them, takes time. And what I would most recommend is getting hold of one of the best books. And I'd be happy to tell you a couple ones that I particularly recommend, and we can put them in the notes for the show that take you step by step through how to practice establishing boundaries on every front in your life, not just with people you're dating or in an intimate relationship with. And I've read a couple books that are just terrific in how thoroughly they break it down, which is if you've had no control over your boundaries or little control over your boundaries for a lot of your life, then it's incredibly helpful to have a book like that that breaks it down into very small pieces and helps you work on it a piece at a time. You know, your boundaries with your friends, your boundaries with your own kids, boundaries with your employers, like if you have housemates, like really breaks it down, including how to deal with your family of origin, which sometimes is where the roots are of having some real boundary problems. And so I'll give you a couple good recommendations to pass on because that's what I would most recommend. And one other thing that it sounds like a lot of women now are already doing, which I do think is really good, was some time of not being involved with anyone and focus on your relationship with yourself and with your relationship with your friends. It's such a temptation to like always have a man at the center of everything. And it's very hard, I think, to create new patterns unless you really step out of that whole scene for a while and just focus on the development of the things you want to develop.
This reminds me of the next question I have for you, Lundy, because I agree with you. And that's something that my therapist has helped me work on as far as like literally giving me a blueprint for how to start to implement boundaries. That was really helpful for me because I come from the opposite of that in my family situation. But the question I have for you then is then the fact that it can be very helpful for women to step away from men. But how do we do that when we're in a current political and legal era where more and more we are being confined and sort of herded into like a general tenor of having to have a man and serve a man and be subservient to men if we want to have any hope of sort of personhood in this country and even worldwide.
It's a really scary backlash time against oppressed people in general, against women, against people of color, against immigrants. It's a really hostile, a scary, hostile time. And the only solution that I know of is bonding together because when things get that hostile, I don't believe you can solve problems individually by changing your attitude or by reading another self-help book or by doing this or that. I mean, do keep doing those pieces of work that you're doing, but people have got to bond together. And my feeling, I know we can't relive the past. It's a mistake to try to relive the past, but we can learn some things from the past. And one thing that I think we really need now is to be drawing on things from 60, 70 years ago, from the, 60 years ago, from the 1960s, when there were just a lot of women's support groups and there were a lot of women's events and women's rallies. And the women really need to get back to bonding with other women. And I know this next one's going to be controversial. Maybe you'll want to edit it out, but I think women really need largely to have those groups be people who grew up female. And it's just otherwise the discussion keeps changing and heading off in other directions. And I believe back in real concrete organizing, support groups, women's rights organizations, the grassroots kind of stuff. That stuff has really slipped away. I've been involved in, feminist politics for more than 30 years since I came into the domestic violence field. And there was much more of a movement, a sense of being part of a women's rights movement when I came into the field. We called it the battered women's movement, and we all considered ourselves part of the battered women's movement. There isn't really any such movement anymore. And so things really have to go back to a lot of in the street agitation, and not just polite marches. Polite marches are great, but there has to be a lot of stuff that's not so polite.
Yeah, the collective liberation needs to be renewed. I call it gender unionization. But I think the point stands. Well, before we continue on, I wanted to remind our listeners that if they wanted to listen to the rest of this episode, please head on over to the bonus content. We want to make sure that you're able to hear the full extent of this conversation that we're having. But again, Lundy, thank you so much for your time. We know we have to let you go, but we hope we can invite you back again sometime soon, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks so much. Same to you. And this has been a wonderful conversation, and good luck to everybody that's listening.
Thanks, Lundy. And Diana, to all of our listeners, what do we tell the scroats?
Die mad.
Die mad, and see you next week.
See you next week.